The economy is going to be one of the most important factors deciding this election, and in many ways your vote will boil down to whether you think Labor has done a good job of steering Australia through the global financial crisis, or whether you agree with the coalition that government spending has been excessive. Whoever wins the next election will be facing up to a possible decade of budget deficits, thanks to pressure on revenue and growing demands for government services, especially in health. If the polls are to be believed, the opposition leader Tony Abbott is on track to be the next Prime Minister, and he'll be the one who has to manage the challenging budget situation. Mr Abbott joined me from Melbourne a short time ago. Tony Abbott, come September, you will most likely be the Prime Minister. You've so far released just a handful of policies and no broad economic plan. Are you asking the public to elect you on blind faith?
Well, Leigh, a couple of points. The first point is that I take nothing for granted. My team takes nothing for granted. We're working very hard every day because we know that while this might be a pretty poor government, they're clever at low politics, so we take nothing for granted. Second point I make is that I'm available every day. Very few days would go by without my being available to the public, and we've put out our Real Solutions plan, we've put out the Strong Australia book, and while the NBN policy that we released a couple of weeks back is the first formal detailed policy of the election year, there are many specific policy commitments out there to abolish the carbon tax, abolish the mining tax, reduce red tape by $1 billion a year, to stop the boats, to introduce a fair income paid parental leave scheme. So I think the shape and structure of an incoming coalition government is very clear.
You mentioned your document, Our Plan, Real Solutions for All Australians, but it's largely made up of aspirations, not actual concrete plans. Are you misleading Australians when you say that you have a comprehensive plan?
Well, as I said, there are some 50 specific commitments that we've made, and I think everyone understands that if they do change the government, we will abolish the carbon tax, abolish the mining tax, get the budget back in the black, stop the boats, build things like the East-West Link here in Melbourne, the Pacific Highway duplication, the WestConnex project. We will have further commitments to make, obviously, on things like the Bruce Highway. I think people understand this, but above all else, what they understand is that if they want decent economic management, if they want to make sure that Australia keeps its AAA rating, if they want a pathway back to surplus, they do need to change the government.
But when you say something like we'll get the budget back in black, that's an aspiration, that's not actually a plan. How will you get the budget back in black when we're talking about deficits of tens of billions of dollars?
We've already said that there are certain commitments that this government has made that we won't go ahead with. We won't go ahead with the so-called school kids bonus because that's a cash splash with borrowed money with nothing to do with education. We won't be proceeding with the superannuation low-income offset because it's funded by the mining tax, which is raising no money. We will, by natural attrition, reduce the size of the Commonwealth public sector payroll because that's 20,000 more now than it was in 2007. That's about $4 billion over the forward estimates. We won't have $6.5 billion worth of border protection blowouts because we will change policy to stop the boats. So I think there's plenty out there, Leigh.
All of that's a lot short of about $70 billion, which is where Joe Hockey put the potential savings you'd have to find. Well,
that's not a correct figure. Yes, we do have to find significant savings, but it's nothing like that figure. Nothing like that figure at all. And let's look, if I may for a moment, take you across the Tasman to New Zealand. The New Zealand national government is on track to get total government spending down from 35 to just 30% of GDP without savage cuts by two things. First, they've made changes that have promoted economic growth, and second, they have religiously guarded against additional new spending, and that's where this government has gone so wrong. Every day we have ministers talking about difficulties with the revenue, and every day the Prime Minister is out there announcing billions in new spending.
But you've brought in the international comparison. Labor's public social spending as a percentage of GDP is below the OECD average. It's below New Zealand. Net government debt in Australia as a percentage of GDP is also lower than virtually every other developed nation. When you look at the stats and the international comparisons, Australia's spending and debt is certainly not excessive.
Well, let's not forget that New Zealand doesn't have state governments, and we do have state governments. And sure, the Commonwealth looks all right in isolation against New Zealand, but throw in state governments and I'm afraid the situation is quite different.
But my point is, internationally, our levels of debt and our levels of spending are not excessive.
Well, I don't believe that is a fair statement, if I may say so, Leigh. The fact is, we do have lower debt than some countries, but that's because we had no debt back in 2007, thanks to the good work first of the Hawke-Keating government, but then the Howard Costello government. Now, debt has increased more rapidly as a percentage of GDP under this government than at any time since modern accounting records were first kept back in 1970. So the expansion of debt under this government is worse than Whitlam.
Well, if you want to talk about fiscal profligacy, the IMF has looked at 200 years of government financial records across 55 leading economies, and it identified only 2 periods of irresponsible spending in Australia in recent years, and they were both during the Howard years.
Well, the interesting thing about the Howard government is that the Howard government delivered surpluses in 11 of its last 11 budgets. So 10 out of 11 surpluses for the Howard government, and over the life of the Howard government we averaged surpluses of almost 1% of GDP. The last Labor surplus was back in 1989. That was the last Labor surplus, and so far Treasurer Swan has given us the 4 biggest deficits in Australian history.
In the memoirs of the former Treasurer Peter Costello, he writes of you, never one to be held back by the financial consequences of decisions. He had grandiose plans for public expenditure. Is that the sort of approach Australia needs in a Prime Minister when we have a predicted decade or so of budget deficits?
Well, obviously when I was the Health Minister, it was important to invest appropriately in new treatments, in medical research and so on. The interesting thing about the kind of proposals that I put forward as Health Minister is that they were all subject to rigorous cost-effectiveness evaluation. That's the beauty of PBS and Medicare spending of the Commonwealth under our system. It's all subject to rigorous cost-effectiveness evaluation, and frankly, if it does pass cost-effectiveness tests, mostly it's worth doing. The problem is that none of the big spending of this government has been subject to serious cost-effectiveness evaluation.
You spoke earlier about your document, Our Plan, and it includes the statement that we have an economic plan for Australia, a plan to lower taxes to stimulate economic growth. Isn't that promise contradicted by your policy to impose a 1.5% levy on big business to fund a maternity leave scheme?
I hear what you're saying, Leigh, and I know that there are some people who are unhappy about that element of our policy, but let's never forget that we are abolishing the carbon tax, we're abolishing the mining tax, and what we want to do is have a modest reduction in company tax that will mean that for big businesses there is no net increase in tax despite the paid parental leave levy, and of course small business will get a company tax cut and a paid parental leave without having to pay the levy. So
can we clarify, will it be fully offset for big businesses?
Well, my hope, and we can't finalise the fiscal position, we can't finalise the timings of these initiatives until we've seen the pre-election fiscal outlook, and I fear that that will be much worse than the government is currently letting on. My hope is that we are able to introduce paid parental leave at the same time as we have an offsetting company tax cut.
Let's turn to education. If Barry O'Farrell, the Liberal leader of the largest state, thinks that the Gonski plan is a good idea, then why doesn't the federal Liberal leader?
Well, look, it's too early to say exactly what the Gonski plan is. The Prime Minister hasn't really come clean. We don't know all the details of what was agreed between herself and and Barry O'Farrell. Look, I'm sure Barry believes that this is in the best interests of New South Wales, and if the Prime Minister can deliver on it, fine. But the Prime Minister has a very poor record of actually delivering, a really hopeless record of actually delivering. This is a government which is great at making promises but hopeless at keeping them.
Well, Barry O'Farrell obviously has some confidence that this promise will be delivered on. Now that his government has signed a deal with the Commonwealth, is that a deal that you will honour?
What we've said is we want to wait and see whether the Prime Minister can bring about a nationally consistent approach. And we're not prepared to commit at this point in time to anything short of that. Let's face it, the existing system is not broken. I don't say it can't be improved. I don't say that we wouldn't, under perfect circumstances, want to put more money into schools, but these aren't perfect circumstances. Our AAA credit rating is at risk if there's not a path back to surplus, and frankly, everything right now, Leigh, has to be tested against that framework. How is it going to help us get back to surplus? How is it going to make our economy more productive?
Before we go, in your own mind, what is the biggest hurdle to you becoming Prime Minister in September?
Well, it's not about me, Leigh. It really isn't. It's got to be about our country. Now,
well, what's the biggest hurdle, though?
Well, it's never easy to win an election from opposition. And as I say, this is a pretty hopeless government, but they're pretty clever at politics, and I suspect every day they will be out there, A, milking incumbency, B, demonising the opposition, C, mortgaging the future in the hope of buying a few votes, and D, booby-trapping the future in the hope that an incoming government will be saddled with a whole lot of commitments that make managing the budget very, very difficult indeed. It's a pretty low and dishonourable government that way, but I think we are more than up to it.
You yourself have written in your book Battle Lines about the fact that you were the hard man of the Howard government, you know, the head kicker, if you like. Is it a problem for you that Australians think that the hard man that we got to know over the Howard years is going to be a hard man as Prime Minister?
Leigh, look, I accept that over the years, and I've been in public life for 2 decades at least, well, really more than that, one way or another now, and a lot of people have come to a lot of conclusions, but I also think that Australians are pretty fair-minded, and they accept that people can grow if they move into a new position. I'd like to think that I have grown as opposition leader, and I am confident that I can grow as Prime Minister should the public give me that extraordinary honour.
Mr Abbott, thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you again over the course of this election year.
Thank you so much, Leigh.